Hello everyone, I'm Justin McMechan and I'm a crop protection and cropping systems specialist located at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center, and today we're going to cover hail damage in soybeans, both the assessment and the management. So soybeans are a rather complicated crop, especially when we get later in the season, but understanding a bit about how to evaluate this crop under hail damage can provide you a bit of ease in what you might want to do and how you might want to manage that crop for the remainder of the season. So crop stage of development is really important in soybeans. It affects how we manage the crop, what we look for in terms of damage. So as we move from vegetative to reproductive stage, things certainly change. And if you've looked over the corn presentation, you're going to see a lot of differences in terms of potential losses at different time points during the season. But we're going to focus on plant death, plant stand essentially, leaf defoliation, which is later in the season once we get to R1. Stem damage, which is really cut nodes, where we're cutting off points of the plant, and we'll talk about nodes here in a little bit. Seed damage, which, loss of seed falling directly on the soil surface, and then any secondary diseases that can show up in these types of situations. So dividing this into two kind of large sections, we've got stand reduction, then we've got plant damage, which is, again, that leaf defoliation, no cuts are broken, and seed counts. So one of the most critical things with evaluating any crop following a hail damage situation is to give it time to respond to that particular damage. And this video will show you a number of days following a hail situation. We actually used a simulated hail machine. We've got both reproductive, this was pretty much R1 stage soybeans when we nailed it, and you can see the crop that we didn't hail back here, to some earlier vegetative stuff. And focus on this area right here. You haven't seen anything happen by day 5 here. We still don't see anything happening. We're starting to see a little bit of regrowth. It's going to zoom into that area here in a second. And day 6, day 7 is when we're starting to see these new trifoliates come out. And that's when we first get an estimation that we know those plants are alive. That's when you can do that safe evaluation to say this is, in fact, a live plant for evaluating stands. So you can't do that the day after the hailstorm. There's no way for me to know that those plants are alive yet. And so as you can see, plants respond fairly well if they're given enough time. Certainly it's behind the development of the crop that was unhailed, but you'll see the evaluation process for that. This one is a little more complicated. Both of these require a lot more than just that plant stand and evaluation. We're going to cover all that. So here we are 17 days out. Clearly this is a pretty good stand of soybeans, and there is significant yield potential left there. Okay, so one of the most critical things is determining whether or not a plant is dead or alive. Often growers want to do this quickly, and there is a way to do that if you need to, but it really requires an extreme amount of damage, and this slide will kind of illustrate that for you. So obviously, dead or alive, plant 1 is alive. That's an undamaged soybean plant. Now plant 2 here appears we've got nodes cut off for where the unifoliate would have been, the unifoliate leaves, but we've got a viable and intact node at the cotyledons, and so the plant can recover from that. You'll actually get 2 stems that come up. In this case, we're missing one of the cotyledons. These are very low yield losses and missing cotyledons. So again, these will recover. Even if we shave off all the plant material, we still have 2 viable nodes in this case. So this plant is technically alive as well. And here, we've even shaving off both, we still have that viable node. Really, the only one we could accurately tell right away that's dead is number 6 on here. Now, some of you may be sitting there and saying, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. And I would agree with you that this is not, none of these are necessarily alive, and this is the reason to wait. We can receive hail damage below this point, this growing point. The plant remains intact, but essentially the vascular system of that plant has been destroyed, and so it can't translocate any nutrients, and it dies outright even though it's this tall. And that happens even in the later stages where we have several nodes that can be present on the plant, but the fact that it's broken below that node and it can't transport any nutrients, it may just be a dead stick 7 to 10 days later. So wait this out. This is one of the most critical parts to making a hail evaluation. Okay, so moving into plant stand assessments, we have, again, just like corn, if you saw the corn presentation, we have 2 different stages that we're evaluating, 2 different tables from the cotyledon stage all the way through to R1, and then from R2 to R3.5. Yield loss assessments on losses are different between those 2. So, if you're evaluating or getting to those tables, make sure you're in the right table. Assessment area, 10 feet a row. So this is a lot smaller of an area to do. And if you've got broadcasted soybeans, you can take out a 3.5 by 3.5 foot square, drop it out there. But in either case, you're determining the original stand. This includes all live, dead, and non-emerged plants. So count everything in that row. If you've got a plant population you already checked, or you're pretty good idea of what's out there, you could use that number to estimate. And then again, those number of live plants, waiting that 7 to 10 days so you're sure that they're alive. Okay, so vegetative stages in soybeans, really important. We're going to get into a more complicated part of evaluating hail damage in soybeans, which is these node cuts, and we really need to know what a node is and how to count those in order to make this assessment. But number of nodes on the main stem, so we can get branches on the plant. I'm going to show you yield components of soybeans in a little bit, and you'll see that there are branches on those plants. So don't get caught on a branch. You'll get a lot less node count than you would have if you follow the main stem. Leaflets that are not touching, like in the case of these up here, they're not touching together, so that's considered a node for counts. And then FCIC, unlike what we use at a lot of the universities, includes this unifolia. Typically we call that VC. They will call that V1. So if you're looking at their charts, you'll need to back up one number if you're staging in the way that we typically stage. Okay, reproductive stage is a little more complicated. These are where assessments get a little more difficult, a little more complicated. You need to know the different stages of development in order to make a good assessment on these. So R1 stage soybeans, this is what we call beginning flower, and we're going to go all the way through to R8, and basically on the slide you're going to see flower in both cases. It's beginning and full, beginning and full. So just think of that. There's 4 large groups of staging for soybeans. Each one is split into like the early part of that stage and the later half of that stage. So beginning flower, R1 stage soybeans flower anywhere on the plant, and the plants can flower for 3 to 4 weeks. To get to full flower, we need it in the upper 2 nodes. So if you count down from those 2 nodes, open trifoliate. If you've got a flower in either one of those, you can consider yourself in full flower. And the staging for reproductive stages between FCIC and the university is the same. So we don't need to worry about any differences here. Once we reach this stage, we have 50% of our total node numbers out there. So you can consider that in terms of the number of nodes that could still be accumulated through what is the R5 stage, because at R5 we can't get any more new leaflets emerging on that main stem. Okay, R3, again, beginning pod, and then R4, full pod. 3/16 of an inch long. We're focusing on now the upper 4 nodes. That's pretty much the remainder of a lot of what we're going to see as upper 4 nodes through at least the next 4 stages of development. So you focus on those upper 4 nodes. If you can find pods that are 3/16 of an inch or longer, then you're probably in the R3 stage. R4, 3/4 of an inch long, and this is our most prone area to seed abortion. Again, when I show that yield components of soybeans, you're going to see a lot of things line up under these 2 stages of development. This is where water use and a lot of management practices become really important. Okay, R5, beginning seed. So at this point, you're going to have to pull off a pod in one of these top 4 nodes you think is most developed. Hold it up to the sun or up to the light. Don't look directly at the sun. Never do that. But you're looking for 1/8 of an inch long of a seed. And once you got that seed at least 1/8 of an inch, you're at the R5 stage. This is a really critical point. Hail beyond here, significant leaf loss beyond here. It's pretty significant in terms of losses, mostly because we can't accumulate any more leaf area out there to compensate for any of those losses. We're at maximum height, maximum node number, maximum leaf area. So this is kind of like VT R1 stage in corn. R6 full seed, the seeds completely fill the cavity of the seed. You can feel this when you pick the pod off. Be sure to take a look at that against a lighted background. Frost at this stage is pretty significant. Again, if you're doing a replant, consider that if you don't make it past R6, 20 to 35% losses. Maximum pod weight is occurring during this particular period. R7, R8, now from the road things become fairly visible. You're starting to see the plants yellow up in the field. You got mature pod color really anywhere on the plant or on the main stem. If you're at this stage and you get frost, a lot less yield losses, 0 to 5%. Seed moisture, we're still at 50 to 60%. R8, we're getting down to that 25 to 35% moisture. Frost will have no impact at this point. 5 to 10 days still to reach 15%. So hail occurring during these 2, still pretty significant losses. You're going to see that FCIC has a totally different evaluation method for these 2 stages than the previous stages. So if you unfortunately find yourself in this situation, there is a way to do it, and at least you'll understand if you have an adjuster out there how they might be doing that. Okay, so this is those yield components. This is just a brief snapshot. We're going to return to this in a little bit. We've got all those different stages. We're going to cover all these components. This just gives you an idea. Plants are present the entire time during the season. It's part of our stand loss evaluation through R3.5. Okay, so converting to plants per acre, if you're doing those assessments, depending on the row width in inches that you're looking at, if you're on 30-inch rows, if you're finding about 100 plants, you're at about 175,000 plants per acre. When you get to the FCIC charts, you're going to need that number to do the conversion. And here's our broadcast method too in this last column. So this is a good reference chart for you. It's in the FCIC document. You see down here 2016 FCIC soybeans, you'll find it too. But that'll be a way for converting those numbers back and forth. Okay, stand loss and yield reductions. This is taken from those charts in the FCIC document. Indeterminate soybeans, which we have a lot of unless you get down into the southern part of the U.S. We've got several different populations listed here. Remaining plant stand versus the population it was at. These are the planting populations that were put in at the early part of the season. And this is that remaining plant stand, and then percent production loss as a result of that. If we look through this chart, 180,000 dropping all the way down to 120,000, no significant yield losses. Once we get down to 90,000 or even 60,000, that's where we start to jump up. And certainly the date at which this happens is important for considering replants. But yeah, we're not talking any significant yield losses really till between 90 and 60,000 plants out there. That's a lot of stand loss for a number of growers. So don't be discouraged if you have a significant reduction in stand. These plants are really good at branching out and filling in those spaces to make up for the lost plants next to them. What this chart doesn't account for is larger spaces of loss, like say 2 feet of an area where we don't have any plant material there. If you're seeing a lot of those spaces and gaps, be generous adding a little bit to your potential yield loss. Soybeans can't account for that large of an area of loss. Just one thing to consider is the spatial distribution of those losses in the field. Okay, node cut off or broken. We're going to go through a little bit of an exercise here just to explain how this works. Certainly a little bit complicated for me, so I have some illustrations like the plant you see here to show this. But applies through the V1. Remember, their V1 is unifoliate stage, all the way through R3.5. You need a 20 plant sample to do this. It does sound like quite a bit when you start doing this, but it's worth it because this is a large part of the yield loss estimate comes from these node cuts. Want to determine total node number. Sometimes this can be difficult depending on the extent of hail damage out there. Find a plant that's still standing or has even a broken node that's still connected. You can upright that and make the total count, but you need that total node number to make a good estimation. And begin at that node just above the unifoliate leaves for counting. You'll include the unifoliate. Ours starts above. So this one, if you count all these nodes on this screen, we have 12 to 13. If you use FCIC, you'd be at 14. So just to clarify how their charts work relative to how we stage. So here's an example. FCIC would say 14 nodes on this plant, so counting from unifoliate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 to the top. And then that's your total here for total number of nodes, and then nodes cut off. So imagine hail coming in and clipping off this plant. It was the same plant that was presented over here. We count the number of nodes here. We would find 8. We'd take 8 divided by 14, so cut versus total. 57% of plants cut off. And then you're headed over to this chart. And this chart is quite long, number of pages. I just zoomed into the area of interest because we have 57% of plants cut off. We are at R2 stage soybeans. We've got flowers in the upper part, the upper 2 nodes, so I staged this plant as well. If we lean into R2, which is right here, we come across to 57%, and we've got 27.6% yield loss. This is not complete yet. If there was stand loss out there, we'd be accounting for that. We'd be adding our stand loss to this 27.6%. And because we're at an R1 stage, we're also going to do leaf defoliation on these plants. I'm just going to cover a chart here that shows you rough node cut, percent of node cuts to total loss. So if you're trying to make a rough estimation of the losses out there, this might help you quickly come to some sort of estimation. Soybean stage, starting at V1 all the way through to R3, which they use for node cuts, and then percent of production loss here on the y-axis. 10%, not a lot of losses out there. It's pretty hard to tell there's much of any losses. I move to 25% average node cuts. I get a little bit more. We're still, probably 10 to 15% total losses once we get to V3 stage. Jump to 50%. Now we're starting to see things jump up. If you remember the corn presentation or have seen it, this is where corn really jumped up in its yield losses too. Getting into these later ones where we can't accumulate any more nodes, that's where R5, which would be somewhere over here on this chart, that's where we really run into potential issues. Very early, which we see a lot of this, as long as you've got viable points, it's pretty hard to cause significant yield losses in soybeans, so remember that. Jump to 75%, things really start to take off. Now we're getting, once you're past V3 on 75% cuts, you're looking at 22% or higher yield losses. Jump up and we get up into this 100% yield loss or 100% node cut. They say 100%, we still have that cotyledonary node that can generate essentially new tissue. So that's why it's not 100% losses, because we have a viable growing point left. But we're talking 20% yield losses early on. So definitely, if you've got early season hail and it looks really severe, give that plant some time. Even if it's got one viable growing point across that entire field and all those different plants that are out there, you're only talking 20% yield losses. And I say only with a grain of salt. It's significant, but there's still quite a crop left. We get into R1 and we start looking at 100% losses. We're right up there, for no cut. That's a big consideration. So, and I've certainly seen fields like this. So that's one to definitely consider. Okay, leaf defoliation, as I mentioned earlier, begins at the R1 stage. We've got our plant that just continually gets destroyed throughout this presentation. So before it had all these leaves on it, now we're looking at defoliation. We're really only estimating the trifoliates below the cut or broken point. This is where a lot of people run into trouble with evaluations. They try to include the entire plant, but we've already accounted with that with node cuts. So we're just looking at remaining leaflets that are left here. We're still using this unifoliate leaf, and we're essentially looking at each trifoliate and saying, what is the percentage of loss? So 33% in this one, since one of the three trifoliates is missing. This one we've got maybe 66%. We've got 100% missing here. We've got a full trifoliate there. 100% missing here. So you'd take an average of that on the remaining tissue that's left there. As an example here, this is about 30% yield losses on average, or 30% defoliation. 5% yield loss just on the leaf loss. We'd add that to the total for the node cut. So assuming in this example we had no stand loss, we'd be looking at a total loss of around 32.6%. You can rewind and look back at the node cut to see how we got to that percentage. That essentially gets us to the total here. And I see I have 40 up here, so if you look in the table you could find 40. It's not a whole lot higher, and you can look back at that chart to see those differences. So again, FCIC, percent defoliation. This is assuming no node cuts. This is all nodes are present and just some degree of defoliation. We've got our stages, VC through VN, and then we've got production losses here on the top. We look at 25%. Remember that VC to VN is almost never going to move just because we don't really account for it prior to that. R1 stage, we're starting to see some potential losses. Pretty hard to even differentiate this from zero, so it's not something that would be of huge concern. We're at 25%. That's a quarter of all leaf tissue removed. 50%. So soybeans are really forgiving if it's just leaf loss that you're seeing out in that field. Smaller hail might not be able to break off the plants, so this might be one to consider. R5 stage, we're getting a little bit higher. Move up, to 75% total defoliation. We're starting to get into more significant yield losses. Really, they're hung up in the later part of the reproductive stages. We go to 100% defoliation. Even at 100% defoliation, R5, we're looking at 80 or so percent yield losses, mostly because the plant's starting to accumulate some of those nutrients into the plant. Once we get to R6, we got a full-size seed there, so that starts to drop actually in potential yield loss. So lots to consider on that one. Okay, I mentioned at R7, R8 stage, we take a rapid transition in how we evaluate. We're not doing leaf loss because we're starting to actually lose leaves on these plants because they're maturing. So really in this case, we're counting seeds, and we want to know seeds per square foot. They're going to do a direct estimation of the potential yield of that crop at that point. So they'll convert this to bushels per acre. They're going to look at the number of live plants in 10 feet a row. That's the first part of their yield estimation, how many live plants are present. And then they're going to select 5 plants, representative plants within that row, and you're going to ignore any plants that don't have seed. So if they don't have seed, don't take any of those for the yield potential. average number of pods, number of plants per row foot. That's what we just talked about with determining the number of plants in 10 feet of row. Average number of seeds per plant, and then we're going to have to gain an estimation of seed size in order to get that total yield. So in this case, you need a graduated cylinder with the cc's filled is what you're going to be estimating for that number. Don't worry, it looks a little complicated. There's a chart that shows you how to convert those numbers. So row factor, this is one of the things you'll be multiplying into this. We're going to show an example here in a second. But if you've got 30-inch rows, we'll say, on the field, you just need to take this 0.8, write it on a sheet, keep it with you. It'll be part of your estimation for determining the total yield that's out there. And if you've got a different row number, you can do a different one from this chart. Seed size factor, so as an example, we got 25 seeds that we placed in this, 25 cc's and 100 seeds. So we take 100 seeds, dump them into a cylinder. They filled up 25 cc's, and so if we go on to our 25 cc's here, which is right here per 100 seeds, we've got a 0.085. So just collect 100 seeds out there, dump them into that cylinder, record the number of cc's that are there, use this chart for that factor. We'll assume that we have 4 plants per row foot out in this field. We have seeds per plant is around 50 seeds. That would be, with this estimation and these two factors that we included earlier and estimated, about 13.6 bushels per acre. And so that's the remaining yield potential at R7 or R8 in this particular field. I get a lot of questions on stem damage. Stem damage is really difficult to evaluate. If you're bugging your adjuster about why aren't you evaluating for all this stem damage, it's because they don't have a good relationship with yield. So we tend to avoid this one as part of it. If you've got a lot of stem damage, you may want to consider the susceptibility of lodging in the fall and prioritize that field for harvest, just like you would corn, to consider additional potential mechanical losses in the field. Okay, we'll get into some of the management portions of this. Replant's a big one in soybeans. In soybeans, unlike corn, you can interplant. I wouldn't recommend doing that in corn. I do see it in some cases. Corn doesn't like seeing green when it's around, and planting too late can result in a non-competitive plant, but soybeans are very forgiving if they come up next to something green. So if we're talking mid to late June, you can drop thresholds all the way down to 75,000 plants. Go ahead and rewind back to those charts on yield losses. You'll see why those numbers are sitting there. We're not seeing a lot of significant yield loss at that point, so you've got to get down to those numbers to warrant a replant. Mid to late June, less than 60,000 plants per acre to warrant that replant. Interplanting, if you're going to do some interplanting, want to bump up your populations. It's still early in the season. You can plant perpendicular to your existing stand is probably the best way to do that rather than trying to plant with it. And then complete replants, depending on the time, you're talking mid to late June. You might want to bump those plant populations to increase some plant height out there. The other thing is maturity group. You might want to move one maturity group lower, especially if you're talking late June, early July. And we've got some data that's coming out on looking at that 2 or 1.1 maturities. Really the 2s, we don't see a lot of significant yield loss with 2.5, 2.6 soybeans. So that might be an option for you, depending on what seed you have available. Don't go with later maturity groups. So don't jump up into the 3, 3.5 if you're planting later. Those do take longer to mature. The risk of frost is certainly higher in that case. Other considerations, narrow row spacing. You've got to drill. Drill's a good option. The reason you're doing this is you're trying to get full canopy closure as quickly as you can. So you can have some depth issues, but less days to canopy closure is the reason to do that. After June 15th, as I mentioned earlier, you can drop that maturity group by 1/2 to 1. Really stick with the maturities that are in your area to make sure you're not falling too far out of line and seeing other losses because of that. Okay, again, another one of those tables. Iowa, we'll assume 100% northern Iowa here, late April plantings, and then just the yield losses you delay in planting or that replant, how much percent of maximum yield is left there. So this is a nice chart to compare with your percent yield losses that you're seeing to say, do I want to keep that crop? Is it worth as much as replanting a new crop and all the costs that come with that? Okay, so a lot of considerations here in terms of fungicides, and in fact, this study by Sisson in 2016 covered even insecticides. But strobilurin fungicides, this is a nice study done over 3 years, 3 locations, pretty strong in terms of its observations, looking at headline and quadris, and then looking at insecticides like alpha cypermethrin. So combination and alone on these particular products. What they did, so I'll go over the study design here. They applied hail using a simulated hail machine at R1 stage soybeans. Then they did a fungicide / insecticide application at R3, and then they did hail again at R4. So this is one of those situations where they had hail, applied fungicide, and then they applied it as part of a practice prior to a hail event occurring at R4. So significant yield impacts from the simulated hail applications. So quite obvious, the hail alone had a significant impact on yield. That indicates the severity was high enough just from a hail standpoint, which is important when we're considering what crop we might be looking at and evaluating. Disease severity was low throughout the whole study though. So that tells you there's not a lot of interaction between the diseases out there and the hail that occurred in that particular thing, or at least it's not elevating the risk relative to an undamaged plant. And no differences in disease in hail plots with or without the pesticide. So what this tells us is there's not a real difference. You don't want to be making those hail applications based on the damage, but based on the likelihood of having significant disease potential out there. Conclusions from this: R3 fungicides provided very little yield preserving benefits. Plant wounds from hail are not required for fungal pathogens. They are required for bacterial pathogens. We do have a few of those. We don't see them as much. Might be something to watch for. But if you do have a bacterial pathogen, don't apply a fungicide to control it. Fungicides don't control these bacterial pathogens. Okay, so we've gone through all this. I'm back to those yield components of soybeans. This is kind of one of those take-home messages. Depending on what stage you're at, you can look across this and say, well, how much opportunity do I have to have new tissue show up? What yield components were present? So again, those stems and branches, stems through R5, we can get a few branches through R6. Flowers will continue flowering and putting on new flowers. If you're void of flowers at R2 or R3 stage, no, there'll be new ones potentially coming out all the way through R5. Pods are going to be present during this period all the way through to the R6 stage when we stop producing new pods. And then seeds and seed number really starts being determined by about R4. So you can see how the evaluations by National Crop Insurance Service line up with these different yield components in terms of how they evaluate things. Okay, so the summary for this, we're talking stand, node cuts, broken, leaf defoliation, and seed counts. That's really R7, R8. No presence doesn't mean the plant's alive. We covered that right at the start. It's a good reason to wait those 7 to 10 days. Stand reduction thresholds for replant decisions decrease over time. We were talking almost 60,000 plants by mid-June. And then fungicides don't seem to provide any of those save any yield or provide any significant yield benefits on a hail damaged plot. Hail nose, great place for a lot of other resources. You can figure out how the storm occurred, it started, assessing damage, which we've talked a lot about today. There's all kinds of things on handling insurance and replanting that you can go into more detail on. Managing that recovering crop, which we covered today. And then if you've really got a crop loss and want to go to another crop, you could maybe look at a cover crop. Great infographics for each one of these, go step by step through the process. So it's an easy way to carry yourself through a very difficult situation. Have additional questions on things I haven't covered, or have a question, feel free to contact me via Twitter, or you can email me at justinmcmechan@unl.edu. Thank you.